Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, my nice new little setup here. So quick announcement before we get into talking about deities. For the past month or so I've been doing some content research, and I've also been chipping away at short form content. That's right, everybody. What I said I'd never do. I am on TikTok and Instagram. You can find me at Fel the Blythe on both of those platforms. I will link them below. It's kind of crazy. I wanted to flesh out my accounts a little bit before I shared it with you all. But yes, I'm now on Instagram and TikTok, so come follow me. Now, on to the topic of today's video. Deities. How to form a relationship with deities as a beginner and all of the good things that entails. Now, not every spiritual person has deities as a part of their practice. Many people consider themselves secular witches, if you will. That was also me for a while, actually. For a long time, I viewed deities in a Jungian sense. And I believed that the gods were kind of fairy tales that we were meant to emulate and that they didn't have any real power. Pro tip: don't be a teenager laughing at gods in the middle of a storm. They will explode your internet. Ever since that point, deities, as they are, as entities, spiritual beings in their own right, have been a part of my practice. As a side note, I'm not here to debate the existence or proof of deities. Frankly, that conversation doesn't interest me. If you're looking for someone to engage in that debate, it's not me. Okay, first of all, you have to make your first contact. Back when witch talk was blowing up in like 2021, 2022, I saw endless opinions and so-called advice on how to contact deities. Most of them were overly complicated and kind of conflicting, like you can't reach out to them, you have to wait till they reach out to you, and watch out, there's trickster spirits. Luckily, I was not a new practitioner at this point and had for years, for better, for worse, been doing it on my own through trial and error. This brings me to those two distinct theories of how first contact with deities is made. Some people say that deities only reach out to you and that you should never reach out to them. I'm not really a big fan of binaries in general, but I think that kind of misses the point. I don't think it's you should only do X and not Y. I think, surprise, there's nuance there. I believe that the gods work through both of those methods in a way that meets you where they are and meets you where you are. Let's cover both of those ideas. When people are beginning their practice, they often feel like they have to be reached out to, and for some reason they're not allowed to reach out to gods themselves. I'm not really sure where this idea came from. Perhaps it's kind of like the idea with tarot cards where you have to be gifted a tarot card and not buy your own. Not an idea that I ever subscribed to. Just that never made sense to me. Especially once you get aligned with a particular pantheon, you don't have to wait around. In fact, I don't think you should wait around. If there is a deity that really interests you, reach out to them. This was the case for me and Hestia. I was looking for an apartment and I was really struggling to find one. At this point, I had already developed praxis with Apollo and Aphrodite, but I didn't consider myself a Hellenic polytheist yet. I was still considering myself some form of witch. Naturally, though, it still made sense for me to reach out to a deity within the Hellenic pantheon because I already had a practice with 2 Greek deities. I just did 3 there. Just took that thumb away. Because I already knew how it worked. It felt easier to reach out than to try to figure out a different pantheon. This is when I did a lot of research on Hestia, and ultimately that research is what led me to Hellenic polytheist groups and then eventually to Hellenic polytheism in general. Something that I don't often see discussed is that just because you reach out to a deity or a Greek hero or some sort of entity doesn't mean that they always respond. I think when it comes to deities, they're far more likely to respond than, say, like a lesser divinity. But sometimes they just don't. And it's not necessarily because of anything that you've done, but rather it's just not where your path is at, and it's not the right fit for you in that moment. I've talked a bit about how I had a relationship or closeness with Thor at the very beginning of my practice, and I actually tried reaching out to other Norse deities, but was ultimately met with silence. At that time, I did not have access to the same tools that I do now, both mentally and emotionally, but also from a research standpoint. I tried celebrating lots of Norse rituals and festivals, and even though I was doing all the right things, there was still just no response. And what's more, I myself didn't feel this urge to really go deeper. I was just doing something to do something. Honestly, with Thor, I don't think I really even had that deep of a relationship. It was this one moment in time because of one particular person that I was with. Thor led me to this greater world of deity worship, but ultimately it wasn't my path to stay there. And well, I mean, look at me now. Obviously, I eventually found a right fit for me. To complicate this a little, I am notably a big fan of syncretism. However, I think that it's easier to start with one pantheon first because you don't want to spread your resources and research too thin, especially if, certain deities treat, for example, death deities differently. You can get confused as to what you're supposed to do and what actually makes sense in your practice, and you might end up burning out before you really have a chance to begin. That being said, if you do have a deep relationship with a Norse deity, that does not preclude you from having a relationship with a Greek deity. It's your life, it's your practice, and syncretism is totally normal and historical. Now, what if you think you are being reached out to? I've spent a good deal of time on various Discord servers and gatherings in real life, and a lot of young practitioners will talk about all the signs that they've seen. And if it means that so-and-so is reaching out to you, I saw pigeons at the train station, does that mean Aphrodite is trying to contact me? Of course, I was also this person once, and I give those people a lot of grace. But I'll say two things on the matter. One, only you can interpret signs. I will never ever interpret signs for you. Even with my own close friends, if they have a sign experience, I can give them advice on how to confirm a sign, but ultimately, you have to decide whether or not something is a sign. No one else can do it for you. Secondly, it is important to be open to signs. I've talked a bit about signs and omens and divination on my channel before, but ultimately it comes down to how it feels in your practice. I know feeling is not really a good objective marker, but it's not really an objective experience. I used to be of the belief that, say, you see a bunch of swans and you live in an area that has a bunch of swans, that you can discount that as being a sign because it's a normal everyday experience. However, I think that the gods meet us where we are physically as well. I think it's important for how the swans, seeing those swans, the context of them, how they feel to you. If you see them floating over a lake at sunset and it just stirs something beautifully in you, that's a whole different experience. But I also don't want you to think that you need signs in order to reach out to a deity. This is your permission right here, right now. You don't need to make up signs. You don't need to read into things that aren't there to reach out to a deity. If you see a swan and it reminds you Aphrodite's pretty cool, it doesn't need to be a sign for you to interpret it as a moment, as a spark to reach out to Aphrodite. Ultimately, though, if you are looking for signs, you should look at supporting signs and supporting divination. No, I am not talking about pendulums. If you've talked to me in any Discord server, if you've heard me rant on Test Tubes and Cauldrons, I'm not a big fan of pendulums at all because they are very, very subjective. They are good for determining what you subconsciously want. They are not good for determining something beyond yourself. That's my hot take on pendulums. I would suggest something more like tarot or runes or Greek alphabet divination or even bibliomancy book divination. Those ones are a lot more objective. Please Don't reach for a pendulum. Just find a D&D dice roller divination thing. They exist. Find one of those instead. It will be far better for you than just confirming what you already want. Some people think that 9 times out of 10, if you are reaching out, or if a deity is reaching out to you, that it's a trickster spirit. Quite famously, I don't believe in that kind of trickster spirit, and this kind of blows people's minds.
So I can't even imagine a spirit paling in comparison to the divine. I can't imagine that a god wouldn't just be like, that's just my 2 cents on that.
This is another reminder that just because someone else believes something doesn't mean that it has to be true for your practice. For example, in Hellenic polytheism, that spirit will get smoted so fast. I got rather annoyed with people suggesting learning protection before deity work or whatever, but in Hellenic polytheism, the deities are protection. Fun fact, I don't do protection magic. I don't. I sometimes wear talismans. If I'm going into a space, like I was going to this event with vampires, it's a whole thing. Like the spiritual path kind, neo-paganism, it's a whole thing. And, I know that there can be some weird people at these events. So with that, I wore a talisman. But in general, I don't do protection magic. I have other things, like I keep certain aspects of my name secret. I keep my birth date secret. That's where I believe the power lies. For me, the gods are my protection. So telling people to learn protection magic before deity work, if they want to be a Hellenic polytheist, is counterintuitive. You don't need protection to be a Hellenic polytheist. I'm sorry. You just don't. If you want to be a witch, if you want to practice witchcraft, and also do deity work in a non-Hellenic polytheist perspective, then you might want protection. Maybe you do believe in trickster spirits in that sense. Belief is very powerful. This is not to say that if you believe in trickster spirits, you're the reason they exist. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that if you are following a particular pantheon, you don't need to worry about certain things. Gods are your protection. Wear a talisman if you really want. Or an image of the god holds power. So anyway, that's my hot pipe and hot tea. Another thing people say is when a deity is reaching out to you, that it's actually you who are projecting some sort of energy that the deity is responding to. This is more of what I believe. I don't really believe that gods single us out to call us to something. I don't believe that necessarily. I believe that many times we subconsciously are acting in a deity's domain. For example, I talked a lot about the muses back in 2018, and I was constantly writing to the muses, and I was doing a lot of creative work, doing a lot of music, and, suddenly I feel a very strong pull to Apollo. I don't think it was necessarily Apollo calling me, but rather I was already operating in the domain of Apollo, and he was responding to that energy. The same thing happened with me and Aphrodite. I got introduced to her was via the nymphs. I have always been very close to water spirits. I think they're very sacred. I think they're very important. I've left offerings to the nymphs of the Everglades, the nymphs of the Atlantic Ocean, the nymphs that live in the lakes by my house. I was always leaving water spirits some sort of offering, especially I consider myself a sea witch towards the beginning of my practice. The ocean was very important to me. I left offerings to the nymphs and water spirits in the ocean. I made a whole altar about it. When I suddenly felt a calling towards Aphrodite, when it suddenly seemed like Aphrodite out of nowhere in 2016 came to me on a beach, it made sense. It wasn't random. I was already heavily operating in her domain. And suddenly, she shows up because she's like, what's up, girl? You're putting all this energy out there. You're basically already reaching out to me. What's up? Now that I've covered the basics of reaching out versus being reached out to, let's move on to practical steps. Before practical steps, I want to address a little bit of an elephant in the room. You might notice me dancing around the phrase working with, a phrase that I tend not to use. If you spend enough time in witchy or pagan spaces, you will have heard working with deities, a deity that I've worked with, etc., etc. There's a lot of buzz and hoopla about the terminology, And I personally don't really like the term because I don't see myself on the same level as a deity. Sometimes people are just avoiding using the term worship. I'm not a coworker of theirs, and I am not coming at it from a witchcraft perspective. I generally am not involving deities in spell work. I mostly chalk the usage of this term up to English being weird, and we struggle to find words that aren't heavily Christian coded. Luckily, though, in Hellenic polytheism, we have the term Kharis, or to have Kharis with, which is a form of reciprocity. This is your relationship, the give and take. This is much more accurate of a term for Hellenic polytheism, so I will be using the term Kharis throughout the rest of this video. Side note, there is actually a term, God work, in Hellenic polytheism and other early religions that is theurgy, which literally means God work. However, this is a specific term that's inviting deities into certain kinds of spells, and was practiced by the Neoplatonists and a lot of other mystery cults. And it was like about trying to make yourself more like the gods, but I'm not talking about theurgy in this video. Okay, your next step. One of the first things that I would do is get comfortable with prayer. A lot of people can get really caught up in their head about prayer, and I was definitely this way too, especially if you're coming from a Christian background or even just growing up in a predominantly Christian culture and you have a lot of preconceptions on what prayer looks like. I grew up as an evangelical, rip to me, and I treated prayer as this free-flowing conversation between me and God because it's a relationship, not a religion. It can be both, babe. While this method is not incorrect, I feel that if you just jump straight from talking to the Christian God like that to a pagan God, that you're not really doing the work in between. Plus, if you think about it, when I was making contact with a Christian God like that, I had had 18 years of being inundated with him culturally as well as religiously and growing up and surrounded in these discourses. Whereas if you're converting, or that's not really the right term, but if you're stepping into a pagan practice, you are not inundated with the religious aspect of this, so it might feel a little bit insincere when you do that and a little strange. Before my family became evangelicals, ripped me, and before that free flowy method of prayer was introduced, I was a part of a more structured Protestant sect that was Episcopalianism. I like Episcopalians. I think they got a nice blend between ritual and relationship. Episcopalian, at least my church that I went to, had a more structured approach to prayer that was actually really helpful as a young, 5-year-old. And if you listen to my podcast, Test Tubes and Cauldrons, with the Science of Prayer Part 1 with Ada and the Witch, check out her socials. You might be familiar with what I'm about to introduce, and that is the ACTS structure, ACTS. A is for adoration, C is for confession, T is for thanksgiving, and S is for supplication. To break that down into a bit more of understandable language today, adoration would be saying something like, confession is not really a part of a lot of ancient practices, at least not in the way that we see it today. But you can kind of sandwich this with thanksgiving, which is giving thanks to a deity for something. A little bit like this. Confession to me is a place to admit some place that you might be struggling. Not saying oh, I'm bad, but saying, hey, I'm struggling in this area, acknowledging it. Supplication is asking for help. When it comes to Hellenic polytheism, you usually sandwich supplication with a promise of a future offering. I'll use a real life example of supplication for prominently. I tend to sandwich prayer with candles and incense as an offering. This goes with the next thing I'm going to talk about. It's a nice way to combine those. The example I just gave was a rather extreme form of supplication, but that is because it was a very large request. You want the offering to be at least somewhat proportionate to the request. Here's an example of one that was fulfilled, and this one is one that really made me see the true power of prayer in Kharis. When I was looking for a job post-pandemic, it was real rough, and I prayed to Hermes. I called upon his name. Hermes of the Marketplace, Hermes of Friend of Mortals. I thanked him for all the times that he'd come to my aid in the past, getting to and from places safely, having a successful job before. I said that if I got a job that aligned with my interests, that I would light an entire package of patchouli incense. I would build him an altar of his own and also offer him an entire bottle of red wine. Within a week, I got one of the best jobs of my life, and I'm still there to this day. Most importantly, I kept my promise as well, and then some. Because of the fulfilled promise on both of our ends, Hermes and I now have a stronger Kharis. When it comes to Kharis and supplication, you have to build this up. I've had supplications that have gone unanswered, and my reasoning for why they might have gone unanswered as well, I don't have enough Kharis with the deity yet, or I was asking too much without the proper amount of equivalent promised offering. I'm not in love with the idea of using anthropomorphic metaphors for deities, but when it comes to YouTube content and ease of explaining things, it's just easier as opposed to getting super philosophical and pretentious. Here is my flawed metaphor. If a stranger at the street asks you to help them move, you are most likely going to say no, even if they were to offer you a sum of money. The reason being is you don't know if they're actually going to pay you that money. You don't know them. Versus if a friend offered you the same thing, you are far more likely to answer yes, and also to answer with, oh, you don't need to pay me, or just pay me in Pizza Man. To continue this metaphor though, if you have a friend and they ask you for help moving in on a certain day, and you say yes, they offer to pay you, that you fulfill your end of the bargain, but they don't pay you, and you ask them and they say they'll get back to you, ask them to then maybe help you out, and they say, no, I'd rather not. You are far more likely next time to not answer their call for help. This is not to say that I believe the gods are punitive. I think that there is a sense of energetic relationship that happens here. If you make a promise to a god to fulfill your end of the offering, but you don't fulfill that promise, the next time you ask for help, you just might not get anything at all. To be completely transparent with you, there have been cases where I have not fulfilled my end of the bargain. I have not fulfilled my promise, and it has damaged the Kharis that I have with the gods. They won't turn their backs on you, but if a promise is broken, you have to work to rebuild that trust. The reason I'm telling you this is I don't want this perception out there that I'm some sort of perfect practitioner who always follows through with what I promised to a deity, or that I don't understand why a promise might have been broken. Sometimes mental health does get in my way. However, just like with my real life relationships, when that happens, I still have to take responsibility. If I promised a friend in real life that I was going to help them with something, and because of my ADHD or depression, I just couldn't get to it, my friend will be understanding because they're my friend, but they are still going to be less likely to ask for my help in the future, and also less likely to expect things from me. Even if they are understanding, you still have to take responsibility. I know that might be a bit spicy, but it's important to acknowledge both in mortal life and in religious relationships. If you are reaching out to a deity for the first time and you don't have Kharis with them at all, this method of prayer might not necessarily be effective. What it might look like for you, I don't have any Kharis with Poseidon, for example, so let me workshop something here. Adoration, you could say, Poseidon, master of the sea and of storms, you are truly great one who rides the dolphin. Poseidon, I've seen the ways in which you have tamed wild oceans, the way I've seen you work in the waves, the time family members were caught in a current and then were thankfully returned safely. If you are communicating with me, or if you are listening, I ask that you give me some sort of sign, and in return I will burn some frankincense for you. On that last point, be specific with the sign that you ask for. If you're communicating with me, I will see your name in real life twice in the next day, or I will see 5 blue jays. Conversely, confirm with divination. You want to be very specific, not vague. Offerings. I would say offering is another excellent first step in contacting a deity. Luckily, in Hellenic polytheism and Roman deities as well, honestly, simple frankincense and olive oil and water works fantastic as offerings, and wine if you are able to purchase that. I've also had success in lighting candles. I personally prefer plain honey candles to burn as offerings, but I have in the past been drawn to certain scents or stories in a candle as a form of offering. It's important before you make an offering to do research. Someone like me who may or may not have a video all about offerings. You don't want to make the mistake of, say, offering a chthonic deity food and then you eat said food after offering it to them. That is considered taboo because the food is not fit for mortal consumption. When you offer something to a chthonic deity, you offer it to them in its entirety. I don't really use foods as offering to chthonic deities. For most deities, just simple candle, incense, water, wine, olive oil. Those all wonderfully do the trick. As I mentioned in my All About Offerings, you can offer something that you're doing. Dance, ocean conservation, making your bed. All of those can be offerings to different deities. Altars. I would say creating an altar is a good secondary step when forming a relationship with a deity. In my Q&A, I spoke about my newer opinions on altars, mostly that they can be fun and be what you make them, but it's also okay if they're temporary. It's often part of a vow of fulfillment for me. It can be a wonderful home for your relationship with a deity and a space that you can physically see the manifestation of your relationship and make it a lot stronger. I have a whole video, as I do with a lot of things, on altars and sacred spaces that gets into the nitty-gritty, but I'll summarize the most important points in terms of do's or don'ts. With Uranic deities, Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite, etc., they have altars that are above ground. You can put it, say, on a table or on a shelf. And the other distinction then is chthonic deities like Hades or Persephone or some aspects of Hermes. It is okay for deities to share space. However, it is important to keep your chthonic deities and your Uranic, your heavenly deities, separate. You don't want to put Hades on the same altar as Zeus. Chthonic altars tend to be on the ground or in the ground, if that's something you have the ability to do. I had the Uranic altar on the top shelf and the chthonic altar on the bottom shelf, representing that distinction. There's a third category that I did not talk about in basically any of my videos, is called Ainolic, which are deities that are of the sea. Sources suggest that some of these altars were markedly different than Uranic ones. However, at the present time, I'm going to be honest, I haven't done a ton of research into Ainolic deities and ways in which they differ from Uranic ones because I don't have a relationship with deities that are solely of the sea. I don't really think you can go wrong with just maybe separating out their altar and putting it on a table. That always works great for me. I have a full altar tour for my previous apartment, but I can show on screen some of my new altars that I have that I'm comfortable sharing. Rituals. So a tertiary step, I would say, would be to complete some sort of ritual with the deity. I don't think I've even completed rituals with all of the deities that I've mentioned. And like, what is a ritual versus an offering or a prayer? It gets really muddy there. But for this, when it comes to making up rituals on your own, I could do a whole other video on that, but that's not really a beginner step, so I wouldn't even look into that right now. I would generally recommend following a festival format for your rituals. So you've reached out to a lot of different deities and you've now begun to form Kharis and praxis with them. You now have what is commonly called the Hearth Cult. A somewhat menacing name, but rather cozy concept. It's a personal pantheon. The Hearth Cult represents the deities that are closest to you, the deities that you have the most amount of Kharis with. Someone asked me how many deities can you create Kharis with? My answer was as much as you have energy for, but you cannot have physically, you just cannot have a super deep relationship with every deity in the world. It's just not realistic. Even if you were to dedicate your entire life convent style, I don't think you could have a super deep relationship with every single deity. So with the Hearth Cult, this is your own personal pantheon, and the deities that you have a day-to-day relationship with, the ones that you can kind of call upon reliably and you are reliable to them. For me, a lot of my Hearth Cult is represented here. Here are deities that I have relationships with. Not all of them are part of my Hearth Cult. I've got Tyche. I have a strong relationship with her, but I wouldn't say I'm part of my Hearth Cult. I've got Apollo back here. He certainly is a part of my Hearth Cult. He's very near and dear to my heart and one of the oldest deities that I've had Kharis with. Here I have Aphrodite. Again, love, part of my Hearth Cult, means a lot to my practice. Here I have Asklepiades. Him got me through a lot of the pandemic. We do have a deep relationship, but I would not consider him a part of my Hearth Cult. Here I have Hestia, certainly is a part of my Hearth Cult. She is my ride or die. She is so important to me, and I go to her for everything. Hermes is back here. He's falling slightly because he's two-dimensional. Ooh, sorry, Apollo. Here's Hermes. Hermes is definitely a part of my Hearth Cult, especially Hermes of the Market. Me and him have had a lot of Kharis back and forth, and I just really love Hermes a lot. This is Hyacinth. Hyacinth is important, a part of my relationship with Apollo. He's not really a deity, so he's not a part of my Hearth Cult. Then I have Demeter. I want to get closer, but in my current living space, I don't have a lot of access to the outdoors or the garden or the earth, and so I wouldn't consider Demeter a part of my Hearth Cult. Definitely someone I would want to be a part of my Hearth Cult, but currently is not. As you can tell, part of my Hearth Cult is 1, 2, 3, 4 deities. It's not that I don't have relationships with other deities, but it's kind of on more of a spectrum. In conclusion, I think that deities are really important, and I mean, you can't have Hellenic polytheism without it. It's literally in the name, polytheism. But they don't have to be as complicated as sometimes people make them out to be. You can keep it simple and still have a wonderfully deep relationship with a deity. I'd recommend starting with one, seeing how that goes for a while, and then add another. It's also important to recognize that deities have different aspects. You're not going to go to Apollo for the issues that are better suited for Aphrodite. You can slowly build this Kharis. You can test it out. Deities might surprise you. I hope this video was useful, and I hope it's a good jumping off point. And with that, I will see you in the next one. And don't forget to check out my Instagram. All right, bye, everybody.
Shout out to my patrons, $5 and up: Anarcho Witch, Annie Nagel, Ikeda Hagubi, Little Raven, Macias Porcius, Nathan Bell, Thistle, and Tiny Alice.